Chapter 30, The Battle of Hogwarts. For a quarter of an hour, Hermione had been pushing against the confines of Pettigrew's spell. Then, without warning, her body suddenly broke free. She stumbled to her feet, Narcissa at her side, acutely aware that Wormtail must be nearby. Any moment now, he could burst through the door of the headmaster's office, likely with Bellatrix or Snape in tow. She staggered toward the mantel, but it was empty, no full powder, no hope of escape. Turning to face the door, Hermione braced herself, but Pettigrew did not appear. If he was not close enough to perform the countercharm, there could only be one reason the spell had failed. "He is dead, then," Narcissa said, her voice strained with fear. Hermione bit her lip, her mind racing. What was happening in the castle that could have led to Pettigrew's death? Had a fight broken out? None of the students were aware that Draco was working with the Order. What if he had been separated from Harry and Ron and caught, the dark mark still blazing on his arm? Worse yet, what if Pettigrew had led Snape and Bellatrix to the Chamber of Secrets? A horrifying image flashed through Hermione's mind, Draco and Ron lying lifeless on the floor beside the skeleton of a basilisk, while Harry was dragged away to Voldemort. Panic surged through her as she hurried to the heavy oak door to inspect it. A quick check confirmed her worst fears. There was no manual lock. It required magic to open. "We need some form of key," she urged. They spent agonizing minutes rifling through Snape's desk and bookshelves, but found nothing of use. Hermione was beginning to contemplate using the desk itself as a battering ram when Narcissa suddenly flung open a cabinet, revealing shelves lined with potions. They sorted through the bottles for a time, until Hermione's gaze landed on a phial filled with a phosphorescent green liquid, its bubbles dancing in the distinctive zigzag pattern she had studied in advanced potion making, combustible concoction. She exclaimed, her excitement bubbling to the surface. Without hesitation, Narcissa snatched up the phial, and together they rushed for the door. A single drop fell onto the doorknob before darting out of the way. The sound that followed was like a small, muffled cannon. A shock wave reverberated through the air, and with a puff of billowing purple smoke, the door swung open, leaving a pumpkin-sized hole where the handle had been. "The chamber," Narcissa said. "Where is it?" "The entrance is in the girls' bathroom on the second floor," Hermione replied, "but we need to find wands first. If Snape and Bellatrix, my sister, believes me loyal, that is all the advantage I need." Narcissa swept toward the door, the combustible concoction still tightly clasped in her hand. She paused for a moment to look back at Hermione. She hardly resembled the Narcissa Malfoy everyone knew. The haughtiness had been drained from her. Instead, she appeared to be sleepwalking through a nightmare, her eyes fixed yet strangely vacant. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but ultimately managed only a nod before disappearing through the door. Hermione limped back to the cabinet to search through the potion bottles, her muscles still aching. All were unlabeled, and while a few were recognizable, she couldn't think of a single one that would be useful against an armed Bellatrix or Snape. Desperately, she picked up an illumination elixir, staring into the glowing liquid with despair. "I'm going to get myself killed," she thought. If she threw herself into combat without sufficient protection, she wouldn't be able to help Draco, Harry, or Ron. She needed a wand, but where could she find one? The question barely formed in her mind when the answer came to her. Stuffing the bottle into her pocket, she sprinted for the door. Surely the room of hidden things would be filled with lost wands. "Wait!" She called out halfway down the stairs, leaning heavily on the railing. "Wait, Narcissa, there's a place we can find." Her words caught in her throat. She gasped, taking a single breath, but the rest of her sentence died on her tongue. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. His white blonde hair tousled and his gray eyes bloodshot. The hem of his robes was smeared with grime, evidence that he had sprinted here. "Draco," she whispered, and in an instant, she flew down the steps as he strode toward her. They collided in a crushing embrace. Draco felt warm, solid, and reassuring. He held her tightly, as if afraid she might vanish if he loosened his grip. "You're all right?" he asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're not." She didn't. Something inside Hermione seemed to dissolve under his touch. It wasn't until she felt the wetness on her cheeks that she realized she was crying. She forced herself to nod, but the words of reassurance wouldn't come. She was alive, and she knew that was something close to miraculous, yet the memory of Bellatrix's cruciatus tearing through her body and the Imperius creeping into the darkest corners of her mind lingered painfully. The echoes of Snape's cruel indifference, Pettigrew's disgust, and every foul word she'd ever heard about herself haunted her. The wound in her neck, though clotted now, pulsed with a dull ache. "Your mother," Hermione whispered, "she's gone down to try and find you in the chamber. It doesn't matter. We've closed it, and Harry and Ron they're fine. Good, that's good." She buried her face deeper into Draco's shoulder, overwhelmed by everything she wanted to say. She longed to tell him that Narcissa had chosen to help her, that she'd witnessed Lucius's limp body being carried away beneath a sheet of white cloth, but her throat felt too tight for speech. They leaned on each other as they descended the steps, and when they finally pulled apart, Hermione noticed streaks of tears on his face, too. They both wiped their eyes, and a shaky, unhappy laugh escaped Hermione's throat. Draco's brows knit together, as if her laughter had pained him. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. "I know," he said, his voice strained, "I know how it feels afterward. But she's never going to touch you again." A sudden wave of anger twisted his features. "I'll kill her before she ever does." "Don't say that," she whispered. Draco had not shown himself to be a killer on the astronomy tower, and Hermione desperately wished he wouldn't become one, not after witnessing the painful struggle he faced with his past. Not even to rid the world of Bellatrix Lestrange would she wish that fate upon him. "We don't have to fight her alone," Hermione continued. "We can find the teachers. I'm sure Sprout and Flitwick will help us hide." "Hide us?" Draco raised an eyebrow. "Granger, the order is already in the castle. We're preparing to evacuate the students." "What? I thought you came here to get a basilisk fawn to destroy the cup." "We did. We have. Why else would I let my robes get like this?" His words drew a faint, painful laugh from her, but her smile faded as he recounted what had happened in the Chamber of Secrets. The way Pettigrew had lived repulsed her, but the way he died was still a nightmare etched in her mind, and then another worry surfaced. "The wand, Pettigrew disarmed you. Does that mean he died as the master of the Elder Wand?" Draco pulled it from his pocket, scrutinizing it closely. "I don't think so. I took it back from him before he died. It feels the same to use it, to hold it. I think it's back under my control." As for Snape, Hermione frowned. "He read the Chamber of Secrets out of my mind with legitimacy. He had the element of surprise. It's a miracle you both survived." But she didn't believe it was merely luck, and she could see that Draco didn't either. "Snape must have wanted something from us," Draco said. "Yes, but what could he want that he couldn't have obtained with the Imperius Curse or legitimacy?" As they rose to their feet, Draco's eyes narrowed in concentration. He was starting to conjure something non-verbally when Potter hit him with Stupefy. It was a glowing mist, reminded me of Pettigrew's hand, the way it looked after it dissolved. "Maybe it was a proxy spell," Hermione suggested thoughtfully. "It's incredibly advanced magic, but Snape could have been trying to channel Voldemort's power. Perhaps it was connected to the Elder Wand?" Draco gestured toward the door. "Either way, Potter should be here soon with him." Hermione rushed to the threshold and peered down the hallway. In the distance, Severus Snape, bound and immobile, was floating toward them, propelled by Harry's wand. "Hermione!" Harry called out, quickening his pace. Before long, she was wrapped in a tight embrace, while Draco took over the task of levitating Snape up to the head's office. Once they reached the upper floor and Hermione assured Harry she was okay, they secured Snape to a chair. Hermione confiscated his wand and tested a few simple spells. Satisfied it would suffice, she said. "What about Bellatrix?" "She knows the password to get into this tower. She was headed to Gryffindor Tower to look for you, Harry." Harry shook his head. "She's not in the castle anymore. I've seen it. He summoned them, and apparently, she didn't dare ignore a direct order. She's joined the rest of the Death Eaters at the edge of Flitwick's defensive enchantments, so have the Carrows." Hermione moved to the window, with Draco and Harry flanking her. They stood in silence for a moment, gazing out into the darkening evening, watching an eerie sea of wand light gathering in the depths of the grounds, the lake, the edges of the forest, the greenhouses, all bristled with the enemy, more arriving by the minute. Voldemort's forces had finally come to end the war. "Come on," Harry urged. "We need to regroup with the Order." But before they could make a move, a voice echoed throughout the room and the castle's halls. Hermione had never heard that voice before, but she recognized it immediately. It was high and cold, echoing through every crack of Hogwarts' stone walls. "I know you are preparing to fight." Distant, terrified screams reverberated through the air. "Your efforts are futile. You cannot fight me. I do not wish to kill you. I have great respect for the teachers of Hogwarts. I do not want to spill magical blood." Hermione gripped Draco's hand tightly, their hold almost painful. Voldemort paused, seemingly aware of the dread his words inspired. "Within the castle walls," he continued, "you are harboring a fugitive who intends to destroy the wizarding world as we know it. For many years, I have worked to prevent this fate and preserve our society. Now, the chance to save Wizarding Britain lies with you. Give me Harry Potter, and no one will lose their life senselessly. Surrender Harry Potter, and I shall leave the school untouched. Hand him over, and you shall be rewarded. You have half an hour." "The others should be in the Great Hall," Harry urged Hermione as they hurried down a secret passage leading to the grand staircase. McGonagall was going to explain the evacuation for everyone underage, as well as how their families can get into Hogwarts to fight, if they want to. "How?" Hermione panted, struggling to keep pace. "We've opened a second passageway from the Room of Requirement into the Hog's Head. They can apparate into Hogsmeade and then come in through there." "Potter, slow down, would you?" Draco snapped. Hermione was clutching her side, visibly trembling. "It's fine," she insisted, though her voice betrayed her. "It's not fine, you've just been..." Draco felt a surge of anger twist in his stomach, recalling what Bellatrix had put her through. "Stop, both of you. We need to decide what to do about the snake, anyway." They came to a halt near the exit to the Grand Hall. The staircase was hidden behind a tapestry. "What's there to decide?" Harry said impatiently. "He's keeping Nagini by his side all the time now. We can't get to either of them while he has the Death Eaters, the Ministry, and every other foul thing surrounding him like this. The only way to handle it is to put up a strong enough fight to lure all his forces out to the castle. Then we can slip away and find him and the snake." "Slip away and find him?" Draco replied, incredulous. "What advantage does that give us anymore? Why fight him in secret?" Dumbledore said. "Forget what Dumbledore said," Draco interrupted. "We should inform everyone in the Order that the snake needs to be killed." "Would you really turn down hundreds of extra people willing to help us?" Hermione looked thoughtful. "He makes a good point, Harry. Voldemort knows we're hunting Horcruxes now. We were keeping it a secret to prevent him from adding extra protections, but Nagini is the only one left." "That's not the only reason to keep it a secret," Harry countered. "What happens once everyone in the world knows what a Horcrux is? Who's to say there won't be a dozen more Voldemorts waiting to split their souls?" Draco sighed. "Potter, after everything you three did at school, you can't pretend you don't know how to tell half the truth. We can say that Nagini is an important source of power for Voldemort. We can insist that someone has to kill her. We don't even need to mention the word Horcrux." Harry's hand drifted to the moleskin pouch at his side. "I don't know. I still don't like it. Anyone who tries to attack Nagini will be risking their lives getting that close to Voldemort, and this," he pulled out a wooden box, the rattling of basilisk fangs echoing softly inside, "might be the only way we have to kill the snake, anyway." Draco bit his tongue. Unfortunately, this was a legitimate concern, roadblock. If they had an arsenal of goblin-made weapons capable of absorbing basilisk venom, things would be different, but charging at an unkillable Horcrux would be a reckless move for the Order. "Well, I'll hold on to this," Draco said, taking the box from Harry's hand and tucking it into his robes. "You can always reopen the chamber and get another fawn, Potter." But if we get separated, no one else knows Parselton. Before Harry could respond, the sound of hundreds of voices echoed from behind the tapestry. Draco peeked out toward the grand staircase and spotted Professors Slughorn, Sinistra, and Trelawney leading a group of frightened students toward the 7th floor. The evacuation started, he announced. Then they'll already be forming groups to fight, Harry replied. Come on, hurry. Harry slipped through the tapestry, but Draco hesitated, his hand lingering on the soft fringe of the ancient cloth. After a year in hiding, the thought of stepping out into Hogwarts as himself, without the cloak, disillusionment, or Polyjuice potion, felt surreal. Goyle, Blaise, Theo, and Millicent might be out there right now, gathering to evacuate. His friends would soon discover he was alive. So would the younger Slytherins who used to laugh at his jokes in the common room, who cheered him on at Quidditch matches, and every single Gryffindor, and a fair number of Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs, who had despised the boy he used to be. And, whispered a small voice in Draco's mind. Lingering in the shadows of the tapestry, he felt his muscles relax and his posture straighten. What did he have to prove to any of those people? To his surprise, a warm feeling began to spread within him. His old pride was returning, smoothing out his defensive edges. It made him lift his chin and embrace the cool confidence of his childhood, stirring within him like water from a spring thaw. He and Hermione had discussed this many months ago, the night he'd taken the diadem from her head. He realized he could never be completely reborn, he could never leave all of himself behind. And what was more, Draco acknowledged, he no longer wanted to. He had made his apologies. He owed nothing more. He felt the last remnants of guilt and regret falling away from him, shedding like snakeskin. Stepping out from the dim passageway, he emerged into the bright light of the grand staircase. Standing beside Harry and Hermione, he noticed the students on the moving stairwell stopping to point at the three of them, their whispers growing louder. Draco glanced at Hermione and slipped his hand into hers. All these people saw where he stood, they might as well know the reason. A small smile graced her lips, and together they strode down the steps toward the great hall. They collided with most of the order in the entrance hall. At the sight of Hermione, shouts of relief erupted. Half the Weasleys rushed toward her, and Draco instinctively stepped back as she staggered under the weight of their hugs. He scanned the entrance hall, hoping to catch a glimpse of his mother. But there was no sign of Narcissa. She wasn't in the great hall either, where the 4 long tables stood empty. Looking for your mum? Tonks asked, sidling up to him. He nodded. Was she here? Yeah, but not for long. She asked me where you were, and when I told her I didn't know, she ran off upstairs looking for you again. Draco nodded, his gaze fixed on the staircase. For now, the castle was safe. At least she hadn't ventured out onto the grounds. You lot, Kingsley's voice boomed through the order, finally breaking the crowd away from Hermione. She was flushed, her hair frizzing from the friction of so many embraces. Newcomers, Kingsley continued, we've divided our forces into 4 groups. One is holding the tower's end, battlements, and aerial defenses. Others were assisting the house elves in preparing supplies, anything that could be used as weaponry inside the castle. A third group had gone out to the grounds to establish an external guard, while a fourth had accompanied Fred and George to seal off any passageways into the castle. The 4 of us, Ron said to Harry, Draco, and Hermione, are supposed to head up to the astronomy tower. Remus has already taken a group that way. Let's go. They left the rest of the order to organize themselves and hurried through the halls. As Harry updated Ron on the state of the Horcruxes, Draco took note of everything around them. The portraits were alive with clamoring painted figures rushing from one end of Hogwarts to the other, delivering urgent messages. Ghosts swirled about, discussing how they might assist in the effort, and all around them, suits of armor sprang to life, clanking down the corridors to defend their castle. As they reached the upper floors, they nearly collided with an immense cauldron filled with bubbling water. Harry Potter, sir, squeaked a gleeful voice from behind it, and Dobby poked his head out. The hallway was crowded with Hogwarts house elves, who had emptied the kitchens and supply closets of their contents. Vats of scouring and stripping potions floated above the elves' heads, while cauldron after cauldron of boiling water was hurriedly transported to the ramparts. They climbed up into the astronomy tower, where the air was filled with the sound of footsteps and tense, anxious voices. Draco felt an electric tension all around him. Finally, they emerged onto the tower's summit. The night was cool, and a chill wind swept through Draco's robes. Dozens of figures were stationed around the circumference of the astronomy tower. Draco couldn't help but glance back at the very spot where he had cornered Dumbledore last year, the place where his transfigured body had lain. As he turned, the robed figures shifted to see the new arrivals. Roughly half of them were students. A great sense of purpose hung in the air. A shout erupted from a group of Gryffindors, Seamus Finnegan, Parvati Patil, and Lavender Brown, while Luna waved cheerfully from her spot among the Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs. But Draco's gaze was locked on the eastmost rampart of the tower, where Pansy stood alongside Gregory Goyle. He halted mid-step, surprised. He had assumed his friends would have evacuated by now, yet there was Goyle, standing firm. The lack of surprise on Goyle's face told Draco that Pansy must have filled him in on everything. Draco glanced at Hermione, who mirrored his shock. She made a small gesture, encouraging him to join the other Slytherins. Taking a deep breath, Draco steeled himself and approached his friends. "Goyle," he said, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Goyle smiled and shook it. He had grown even taller and broader, towering over Draco by nearly a head. "What are you doing here?" Draco asked quietly as he released Goyle's grip. "What if your father's out there?" Goyle shook his head. "He's still at Mungo's, and honestly, I think he'd be relieved if this all ended soon. Pansy and I decided we were done with this by the end of the first term." "Really?" Draco hesitated. "I saw Crabbe earlier." Goyle let out a grunt and turned back to face the battlements. "He's lost it, especially after what happened to his dad at Azkaban. He won't talk to anyone except Millicent now. He even called Blaise and Theo blood traitors, just because Blaise wouldn't convince his mum to take the mark and Theo wouldn't curse a second year during detention. So, I suppose Theo and Blaise have evacuated?" "They're in the room of requirement," Pansy chimed in, leaning against the rampart with her wand gripped so tightly that her knuckles shone in the starlight. Blaise mentioned that he and his mum have been considering leaving the country. Apparently, they own houses in the States, Nigeria, and Greece that nobody else knows about. In cash and unplottable, so, if all this, she gestured toward the grounds of Hogwarts, collapses, he said we can all go into hiding together. How's that for an offer? Draco couldn't help but smile as he drew the Elder Wand from his pocket. 3 secret houses ready for evacuation. I've never heard anything less surprising about the Zabini family. Goyle and Pansy chuckled, and Draco leaned against the rampart beside his friends, but their smiles were fleeting. The sea of wandlight beyond Flitwick's enchantments had expanded into an ocean, encircling the castle. Draco glanced to his left and saw Hermione, Harry, and Ron filling in the gap. As the ring of students faced outward, their houses became indistinguishable among the dark ranks. The last murmurs faded into silence. Something was brewing near the Hogwarts gates. The glow intensified, spreading and shifting to a deep purple. Then, an enormous crack echoed through the air, as if a thunderhead had burst open. Flitwick's enchantments had been shattered. The enemy surged forward. "Ready, everyone?" called Remus. "Aim your jinxes and hexes high, and, now." Dozens of wands shot up into the night sky, unleashing a dazzling firework of spells from the top of the tower. All around the castle, Draco could see the same spectacle unfolding. Ignited by their attack, flashes erupted down the ramparts like a sequence of hundreds of cameras going off, while the sound of shuddering blasts reverberated from their points of impact on the grounds. At first, Draco thought the deep booms were solely from the spellwork, but then he spotted towering figures looming at the edge of the grounds. A chill ran down his spine. Giants, dozens of them, each standing 25 feet tall, moved slowly past the lake. "Winky," called Tonks from somewhere behind Draco, "tell Kingsley we've got eyes on 14 giants. They'll each need a dedicated team." "Right away," came Winky's reply. "Miss," said Winky, and with a crack, the elf vanished. "Brooms!" Someone shouted. Dean Thomas, Draco thought, and every head turned skyward. Flyers were pouring out of the moon like black rain, spells cascading down around them. A flurry of shield charms sprang to life, including 2 hazy barriers conjured by a pair of grizzled witches Draco didn't recognize. Most of the attacks slammed into the shields and ricocheted backward, scattering the flyers, but several spells broke through, forcing everyone on the tower to dive behind the ramparts for cover. Counterattacks. Tonks's voice rang out. "Now!" They sprang to their feet and launched a volley back into the night. Draco unleashed spells from the Elder Wand, their power rivaling any he had ever wielded in a duel. But aiming was nearly impossible. He couldn't tell what kind of brooms the attackers were flying, but from the sharp turns they executed, it was clear these were no ordinary family brooms passed down through generations. They had been hand-selected for aerial assault. Another wave of attacks came crashing down. As they ducked behind the ramparts, Draco seized Hermione by the elbow. "Hermione, Potter. Weasley, we need to get back inside the castle." "What?" Ron exclaimed, his face a mask of outrage. "But," Draco raised the Elder Wand, "we need to keep control of it if Potter's going to use it against Voldemort. We can't risk losing ownership during a flyby attack. And we need to target Nagini." Harry added, his gaze distant. "I can see him moving." He was staring into the distance, the glow of spells flickering across the lenses of his glasses. His eyes fluttered shut for just a moment before he snapped back to focus. "He's crossing the grounds. He and Nagini, they're not following the rest of the troops." As Draco scanned the chaos below, an idea struck him. "Potter. The room of requirement, when you see where he settles, we can open a passage right near the snake," Draco suggested. "Then we pull the snake through." Ron exclaimed, "Or we could just reach out with the Fong in." He swung his wand, sending a stunning spell flying into the night sky. Just as they began to dash for the exit, Remus shouted, "Students, fall back into the castle, cast through the windows instead." "And you 4, he rushed toward them, deflecting a spell with a swift movement of his wand, as if he were wielding a bludger's bat. "I need you to get a message to Kingsley, but not through the portraits. It could get lost in the chaos. With this many flyers, it looks like they're trying to breach our defenses through the aerial entrances. We need to triple the guard up here, and we need experienced battalions, not students. Got that?" They barely nodded before being swept back by the other students, all rushing through the entrance to the tower. A dozen older fighters quickly formed a barricade. Transfiguring pieces of wood into a solid block, Draco cast one last glance back as the wooden barrier thudded into place, shutting out the stars. Hermione's eyes darted through every passing window as they ran. One of the buildings in the lower courtyards was ablaze, black smoke billowing into the air like a massive, dark shroud. "Do we know where Kingsley's stationed?" She panted. "Yeah," Ron replied. "He set up a team of Exorers in the entrance hall. They've been barricading the windows on the ground floor." Overall, the state of the halls reassured Hermione. In stark contrast to the chaos outside, the castle's interior felt tightly ordered. Each window had one or more fighters firing spells at the encroaching forces of Death Eaters and Ministry officials. She could see tightly clustered groups charging toward areas under heavier attack. As they sprinted back to the grand staircase, Hermione mentally reviewed the plan to trap Nagini. It could work, provided they caught Voldemort off guard, but the risk of accidentally allowing him access to the room of requirement was a terrifying thought. Could they create a diversion, a momentary distraction for Voldemort while they opened a passage to snatch Nagini from behind? She realized it all hinged on where Voldemort and the snake would end up. They raced down the first-floor corridor, passing Fred and George, who had gathered a group around the statue of Gregory the Smarmy. The passageway behind it gaped open, shimmering with dangerous enchantments, while others in the group conjured a formidable blockade of brick and stone. "Everything all right, you 4?" George called as they rushed past. "Need to find Kingsley," Ron replied. "He's still by the front doors, just saw him a minute ago." Fred shouted after them. The sound of an explosion echoed through the open windows, causing everyone in the hall to flinch and seek cover before returning to their posts. Hermione rounded the corner with the others and emerged at the top of the sweeping stairs leading to the entrance hall. There stood Kingsley, his imposing figure stationed at the front door, flanked by a host of hardened witches and wizards. Behind them, 24 house elves stood ready, hands outstretched for wandless incantations. The immense bangs and thuds resonated against the door as the Death Eater's forces attempted to break through. They charged down the steps. Kingsley! Harry yelled as they reached the bottom, but when the Aurors and elves turned away from the door, their horrified gazes were fixed on the ground floor passageways flanking the stairs. Hermione spun around with the others just in time to dive for safety. Scores of Death Eaters in robes and masks poured out of the corridors, unleashing spells toward the Auror guard at the front door. Hermione threw herself behind the marble banister, feeling a fragment of stone explode and sear across the back of her wrist, leaving a bloody trail in its wake. Breach! Kingsley roared. A second wave of Aurors and elves surged out of the Great Hall, ready to defend their ground. As spells began to fly in earnest, Hermione suddenly realized she had become separated from Harry, Ron, and Draco, who had dove forward into the Great Hall for cover while she had instinctively flung herself backward. She cast a frantic glance up the broad stairway, which was still empty. They desperately needed reinforcements. Without a moment's hesitation, she sprinted up the steps, racing away from the chaos below. Only when she reached the landing and the safety of a nearby statue did she dare to look back, her mind racing with questions. How had the Death Eaters managed to infiltrate the castle? The answer struck her as she spotted a Death Eater's robes dragging across the stones, leaving a shimmering trail of water behind. They had entered through the lake and the Slytherin common room, the very route they had used to escape Hogwarts the previous summer. With a determined grit, Hermione pushed through the massive doors at the end of the landing, stepping back into the first-floor corridor. She raised her wand to her throat, amplifying her voice, and shouted, "Everybody!" Fighters stationed at the windows turned to look. There's a breach in the dungeons. They've entered the entrance hall. She pointed urgently toward the landing. We need to seal off the dungeons and hold the front doors. The response was immediate and astonishing. Every person in sight sprinted toward her, wands at the ready. Hermione pressed herself against the wall as a wave of fighters rushed past her. Professor McGonagall burst out of the nearby Transfiguration classroom, a dozen fully grown lions springing forth from her wand tip. Hermione recognized them as former desks, their talons carved from graffitied oak. "Coming, Hermione!" Fred called out with a fierce grin as he sped by, the thrill of battle lighting up his eyes. "I can't promise I'll leave any Death Eaters for you." "All yours," Hermione panted in response. "I need to gather more reinforcements. The towers are under attack too." "Don't go by the defense room," George shouted, jogging backward. "There's a cave-in near there. Take the hall by Filch's office instead." Hermione nodded in gratitude and sprinted through the castle, directing group after group toward the entrance hall or up toward the towers, just as Remus had instructed. Outside the windows, the scene grew increasingly dire. The top of Ravenclaw Tower was enveloped in a menacing yellow glow. One of the giants had reached the south face of the castle, hurling boulders at the walls, each impact resonating with a cataclysmic boom. Triple the guard, she thought frantically. Had she sent enough people to the towers? She needed to get back to Draco, Harry, and Ron. The Room of Requirement would be useless without Harry's insight on Voldemort's whereabouts, and she had no idea if they'd noticed her leave the entrance hall. They could still be searching for her there. She turned on her heel and ran, but halfway there, she halted abruptly. The deep, splintering crash echoed ahead, and shouts transformed into screams. Hermione instinctively knew the front doors had fallen. Terror surged through her. They had to retreat, get out of the entrance hall. All the Death Eaters would be pouring through that single route. Hermione darted around a corner and spotted the landing to the entrance hall, but the door leading out was already barricaded. Frantically, she searched for the cluster of Order fighters and found them. Harry, Ron, and Draco were in the midst of a heated debate with Fred and George. Might still be down there. Draco was insisting as Hermione rushed toward them. She's not, Fred replied. How do you know? Draco shot back. Because she's right there, George said, pointing at Hermione. Draco, Harry, and Ron turned to her, relief washing over their faces. They've broken through? She gasped, skidding to a stop. Yeah, Harry confirmed. Kingsley and the others are barricading the other side of the landing. Just then, a tremendous boom shook the ground beneath them, to pull them away from the chaos. Shards of wood flew through the air as the barricade splintered. A chorus of voices cried out, "Reparo!" And the hole sealed momentarily, but Hermione could still hear the relentless assault of spells striking the door from the other side, chipping away at the enchantments as quickly as the Order could reinforce them. We need to regroup somewhere, Ron gasped, panic evident in his voice. There are too many of them. Fred and George exchanged a knowing glance. There's a passage behind the tapestry of URG the Unclean, George said. It'll take us out to the 6th floor, Fred added. We need to put some distance between us and them. Sound good? Perfect, Ron replied, relief washing over him. Fred nodded and gave Ron a reassuring clap on the shoulder. Oi! Fred called out, turning to the members of the Order, you lot. The Order members, who were busy reinforcing the barricade, paused to listen. We're regrouping on the 6th floor, Fred continued. Follow my brother Ron, he'll lead the way, but before he could finish, the barricade exploded in a blinding flash of light. Hermione squeezed her eyes shut, feeling herself lifted from the trembling ground as a deafening roar filled the air. She clutched her wand tightly with one hand while instinctively bringing the other to the back of her neck, bracing for the worst. She waited for the heat and agony of the explosion to engulf her. When the sound finally faded, she forced her eyes open, aware that time was slipping away. She struggled to pull herself from a pile of rubble, warm liquid trickling down the side of her face. Reparo. She croaked, her ears ringing. She tried to move in a straight line but staggered sideways. Arrep, her voice faltered. Nearby, she spotted Harry, Draco, and 3 red-headed men huddled on the ground. A sense of dread gripped her throat. No, no, no. Someone shouted, no. Fred, no. We've got to go, Draco urged, his voice urgent. Get up, we need to run. He and Harry grabbed Ron and George's arms, desperately trying to pull them away from the devastation surrounding them. Hermione rushed down the hall, finally reaching her friends, but for a moment, she was paralyzed, unable to think, speak, or move. Fred lay sprawled before them, his face lifeless and expressionless, a stark contrast to the warmth of life he once had. A gut-wrenching blast jolted her back to reality. Behind them, the members of the Order were frantically conjuring planks, stones, and magical shields, desperately trying to reinforce the barricade even as spells from the Death Eaters continued to slam into it. With a surge of determination, Hermione tore her gaze away from Fred and gripped Ron's arm, pulling him back with all her strength. Finally, he relented, dragged away as desperate sounds escaped him. But George fought back fiercely, unwilling to leave his brother. They had barely taken 5 steps when he broke free, throwing himself back to Fred and hugging over his brother's body. Go, he shouted, spinning around to point down the hall. Go! The barricade splintered ominously as it began to collapse. Their allies were retreating now, racing down the corridor, clutching their injuries. Hermione was dimly aware of pulling Ron backward alongside Harry and Draco, even as Ron's face turned crimson with effort, struggling to break free and return to his brothers. Fred, he howled, his voice cracking in a way that resonated painfully in Hermione's chest. George. But George was beyond hearing. As the barricade shattered before him, he unleashed spell after spell into the swarm of Death Eaters, kneeling beside Fred's body, one hand protectively covering his brother's chest. The last thing Hermione saw before they pulled Ron around the corner was George, momentarily frozen by a jet of green light, before he fell beside Fred, refusing to be parted from him.